everybody, I'm Peachy and I am here with JB talking about some data protection legislation that is potentially going to be passed very soon or sometime in the future. And he thinks it's one of the most important things that's going to happen in our lifetimes. And I thought that was pretty wild considering the things going on in the world. So let's hear it. What's going on, Jonathan?
So there's 4 bills currently in the United States Senate, and then there's more expected to be introduced. In fact, by one count, I think there's been 25 different ones introduced over the last few years, but there's 4 current ones that have current sponsors. And these are all general data protection bills, which is to distinguish them from bills that you may be familiar with, like HIPAA, which protects health information, or the COPA, which is for children's online protection. These in the United States federally, we don't have any general data protection bills. We just have some specific things that are protected. And a few years ago in Europe, they passed the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, which was a really comprehensive bill to protect individuals' data in Europe. And what's happened is in the United States, the European legislation or the General Data Protection Regulations are hated because the business community finds them to be very inconvenient. It's difficult to know exactly how to comply with them a lot of the time. If you do business in the EU, you end up having to comply even for customers that are outside the EU. There's some debate about where the line is there, but essentially, because it's difficult to know exactly where your customers are, you have to comply outside of the jurisdiction just to avoid violating it for customers to which it would apply, to which you would have to follow the regulations. Even though they may not be in Europe at the time or something. So a lot of people have noticed that websites they go to have much more robust disclosures about what they're tracking. That was all a result of GDPR going into effect a couple years ago. But the idea of general data protection legislation is to answer the question, to what extent do individuals have the right to control how their data is collected and used? That sounds fairly straightforward, but the implications of how we answer that question are profound. They will affect every aspect of our lives, and they'll reverberate for generations. That's why this is so important. It's not just about creepily targeted ads or robocalls, or even concerns about identity theft and that sort of thing. If you think about the impact that federal credit reporting agencies have had on American life in recent decades, your credit score, most people spend a lot of time worrying about their credit score. It affects whether you're able not only to get credit, but also background checks, whether you'll be able to rent certain apartments, whether you'll be able to get certain employment. This data that was collected with the idea that it was going to make credit more accessible because it would enable creditors to know whether a potential debtor was creditworthy or not, has now become a kind of social credit score for the United States, where when you want to get, a nice apartment, they're going to do a credit check. When you want to when you apply for certain jobs, if you have a job that requires any kind of security clearance, the background check's your credit report's a big factor. But that's just one tiny aspect of our lives where our data has been collected and used in ways that were not intended when that data was first starting to be collected. And this is the amount of data that is being collected and the ways in which it is being used are rising exponentially. 20 years ago, most of us could not have imagined how much of our lives were going to be digitized, tracked. Everywhere we go, all of our interactions with our devices, everything we buy, it's all tracked, and that's only going to continue to increase. So if we don't have the ability to control when it's being tracked, know that it's being tracked, control how it is used once that data is collected, and to do something to correct it when information is inaccurate or is being used inappropriately, things will get dire very quickly. A couple of quick examples of things that are already happening with our data that are unintended, at least from our perspective as consumers. Most of us use one or more apps that we're aware track the way we interact with the apps, social media apps. And we assume generally that those apps use that information to serve us targeted ads and maybe improve, quote unquote, improve their apps. But what app developers have learned is that by analyzing the way we interact with these apps, they can glean information about our mental health status, and they can impact our emotions positively or negatively. Meaning that for most of us, their app developers, these tech companies, have information about our mental health that we may not even have ourselves, and an ability to influence it in ways that we may not even be able to ourselves.
So that might mean that they could sell that information to someone else who has more of a nefarious agenda for how which to use that data?
Yes.
Which could be any crazy amount of valuable to any other company somehow.
Well, theoretically, they would need your permission. So there's nothing stopping them except if a company collects data about you, they right now, unless it falls under one of those specific data protection laws that's federal, so like HIPAA or something like that, which these would not. The interesting thing here is some of this information is completely developed completely gleaned from analysis of activity within the app. So they aren't even necessarily worried particularly about our consents to how it's used.
Because we already gave it.
Yeah.
Correct.
Well, when's the last time anybody read a click-through agreement? When we use all of these apps and software, you almost always agree to terms and conditions without reading it. And even if you do read it, which, let's face it, no one does, it's so dense, most people have no idea what they're agreeing to. So theoretically, if your data, you have the ability to, deny one of these companies the ability to use your data, but in fact, you really don't. Nobody. The only way you could, it would be to not use the app, but if it's not one app, it's going to be another. If it's not one piece of software, it's another. If it's not one phone company, it's another. So even though, yes, it is conceivable that we could avoid using certain apps and try to minimize the damage, there is no way we're going to completely avoid our data being collected just overwhelmingly, everything about us. Facebook has just announced that they are going to be serving ads in their virtual reality system that they bought, Oculus. And, virtual reality and augmented reality systems generally have eye tracking technology in them. And as soon as you start giving one of these companies access to eye tracking technology, there's so much information about human psychology and human behavior that we actually study by studying eye movement, that it just opens another Pandora's box of information that we're giving them access to about ourselves that we don't even know the extent of.
So let's say I live in a state like California, which I know currently has laws in place to protect Californians from things like this. Would this legislation impact that in any way? Or should they feel confident that they live in California?
Well, okay, that's a good point. The most important protection we have right now as Americans is actually a few states have fairly robust data protection laws. California is one of them, and the most important one probably because that law is written to try to force anybody who's doing business in California to comply with the law for all their clients, even if those clients happen to not be in California. They can't do that entirely. There's jurisdictional issues, but it is a fairly robust mandate on a lot of these companies. The issue is that the business community hates having to worry about the different privacy and data protection laws in every jurisdiction. So they are pushing very aggressively, and I have sat in meetings with various legal professional associations and lobbyist groups where it is absolutely explicitly stated that their top priority is to obtain federal preemption in this area, which means they want a data protection law that is going to nullify all of the individual states' data protection laws. And it would make it so that no state could pass their own if they wanted something more, because it would be federally preempted. The Constitution has a clause called the Supremacy Clause that means that if a federal law is intended to, what they call it, occupy the field, means if it's intended to be a comprehensive regulation for an area, then no state law can apply to change it. So technically all these individual states' data protection laws would still be on the books, but they would have no effect. So no, this legislation in the United States Congress will completely undo all of the progress that's been made in individual states in this area. Now, that might be okay if the law that's passed has it's not only adequate, but well-conceived protections for individuals and also reasonable restrictions on businesses and enterprises so that they can continue to operate. I mean, it is no small thing to over-regulate data because this applies to everyone. It will be almost impossible to conduct business of any kind without having to comply with data protection regulations because of the way we define personal information. So yes, it's not helpful that anybody may have good data protection laws in their state when one of these things passes. Currently, the bill in the House explicitly provides for preemption. It's introduced by Representative Susan Delvine from Washington. And I'll have to double check, but I'm almost sure all three of the Senate bills contain that as well. And it's not horribly important whether any individual one doesn't, because these things will change so much before they're passed, and with so much lobbying effort to get a federal preemption provision in, we need to pay very close attention. And yes, more than likely, whatever passes is going to have a preemption provision.
So what would you say to the overwhelming majority of people that I encounter talking about this issue who would say, I'm not doing anything wrong, targeted ads are kind of sweet, they remind me of things I talked about earlier and maybe I actually needed. So if I'm not breaking any laws, I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm an open book.
Well, so if you're worried about laws, you're probably thinking about privacy with respect to the government, which is a huge issue. There's been a lot written about the Patriot Act and the Snowden leaks and the mass surveillance by the NSA, PRISM. These are all instances of our government instituting mass surveillance in violation of our civil rights. It doesn't matter if you're violating the law or not. This should be extremely concerning to everyone, wherever you are in the political spectrum, and whether or not you think you're doing anything wrong. However, even if you implicitly trust the government and you don't have any problem with the government having access to all of your data, do you also trust every government employee? Because the government won't be the only one that has access. Every government employee that is serving in a relevant position will also be able to access all that data. And even more importantly, when all these private companies are collecting your data, do you trust all of the employees of all those private companies? Because we know of myriad instances of individuals within the NSA, the government, or within private companies using their access to these databases to stalk their exes, to check in on people, to try to find information about people so they can go try to meet them in real life or find out where they are. So it's a safety issue far beyond avoiding prosecution for crimes. It is a privacy issue far beyond just whether you trust a given entity to make good decisions with respect to your data. It is so profound. It's hard to comprehend. I mean, most of us think that we've given our data to, we've agreed to give our data to a given company for a specific purpose. And when you really get into the terms of these agreements and the wide liberties they have, the companies have to transfer our data or at least share it with contractors of theirs or business associates, the leeway they have to use our data for vastly different purposes than we thought they were using it for could be staggering. So it's not just about whether we trust a given company to use our data for a specific purpose that we've agreed to. As things stand, we have very little control over our data. But it could be even worse if data protection bills get passed that have toothless regulations. And the two primary things the business community wants are preemption that we just talked about and a liability shield, which usually comes in the form of a provision explicitly not providing a private right of action for misuse of your data, and some sort of safe harbor. So they say if you're a data collector or processor, if you do X, Y, and Z, then there's no liability, even if there's a data breach or even if somehow the data gets misused. That is probably catastrophic. But the issue is that every stakeholder that's actually being consulted are basically exactly the wrong people to consult about this. So major tech companies are heavily involved in this discussion. They have access to the Congress people. Most of the actual people from those companies and from the industry, including groups that I'm involved with, are IP lawyers like me. And their primary concern is to make their lives easier and make the lives of their clients easier. It's nothing nefarious, but they want to know a very simple set of rules that they can follow to advise their clients on how to be able to get their business done. They want to, be able to innovate. They want to be able to quickly change the nature of what they're doing if they find some more profitable or more interesting avenue to pursue. And they don't want to be bogged down in red tape of getting consents and having to deal with individuals wanting their data erased or changed. And they don't want anybody suing them. And they don't want hackers to steal their data, or an employee to leak their data and then to have to notify millions of people that their data's been taken, and then have liability for getting class action lawsuits or the like. That's understandable, but the thing is, $100 billion or $1 trillion tech company, even if they are greatly inconvenienced by these regulations, they will be fine. They will get through it. They will work it out. If we pass a law that doesn't protect individuals, individual lives will be completely destroyed, and there will be no recourse, and there will be no help. It will just wreck lives. And individuals are hardly aware that these regulations or these bills even exist. Most of us don't even know what data protection regulations are, or what they look like, or what provisions they might have or not have. And nobody's asking. And the most important stakeholders are actually young and unborn children, because they will be growing up in a world where every action they ever take is tracked and recorded and immortalized. And it is not fair to ask a child to grow up in a world where every indiscretion, every mistake, everything they ever do, no matter how silly or wrong or embarrassing or just childish, is going to be recorded for all the world to see for the rest of their lives, and follow them and prevent them from getting jobs and into schools and positions.
And we always hear people say, or we say, like, everything on the internet can't be erased. So just in the minds of a lot of people, I think, they think if you don't post about it, if you don't tweet about it, if you don't post a picture of it, of your mistakes, then you're safe to some degree. But what I'm hearing from you is that that's not the case, and if this kind of legislation goes through.
Well, I mean, it depends on what it looks like when it goes through. I think
Right.
The important thing for us to be doing right now is to educate ourselves about it, be aware this is going on, and talk about it. Talk to your friends, family, colleagues. Everyone needs to be in on this discussion, needs to be part of it. It can't just be lawyers, lobbyists, and executives from tech companies determining how this goes. Even if all of those people are well-meaning, they don't have the right perspective to understand how profound this will be for everyone. You're right. First of all, posting something online, most of these bills, as they currently stand, will not protect any data that's posted online intentionally. So that'll still be a problem. But there are myriad ways in which your data can get from private, protected, encrypted, where only you can get it, to where everyone on the internet can get it. And if we don't enact legislation that is well thought out and that is agile enough to be able to adjust as our world becomes increasingly digital, we're going to end up with a situation where an individual's private data can become so public that it destroys their life and there's nothing they can do. One of the rights that the GDPR, the European Data Protection Regulations, attempt to protect is the right to erasure, so that you can demand that certain data about you be erased. There actually are certain instances where that may not be desirable for society, but it's absolutely necessary in many instances for individuals to be able to have a chance to fix something that's gone wrong vis-a-vis their data.
Like an error in their data?
Well, yeah, that's a separate right. In the GDPR, that's called the right to rectification, which is essentially that you can demand when data about you is inaccurate, you can demand that it be corrected, which is, again, very important. I mean, I think John Oliver did a segment a few years back about somebody who was inaccurately recorded as dead. So she suddenly couldn't get a loan because the credit reporting agencies were saying she was dead, something to that effect. It's just a seemingly comical example, but you could actually imagine how dramatic that problem would be for that person if there's no way to fix it. And I mean, an example is Airbnb recently bought an AI algorithm company that does background checks on people's data, and it uses this AI to analyze their data to determine whether they are too closely associated with what they consider undesirable things. So, for instance, if it's not just if you're a felon that they may ban you, but they may ban you because you're too closely associated with people with felony convictions. It's not just they may ban you because your data is closely associated with an IP address that's been associated with sex work. There's nothing forcing Airbnb, if they make some determination like that, even if it's totally inaccurate, there's nothing to force them to reverse a ban that they've instituted. It's a private company. Essentially, they can just say, no, we don't want you as a client. Yet, that can be catastrophic if you multiply that out. If your data somehow becomes undesirable, according to these AI algorithms and tech companies, you may find yourself blackballed for nothing other than just being unlucky. And if we have no ability to find out what is in that data, no ability to demand that it be corrected, no ability to get information erased that is inaccurate or just inappropriate for public consumption, it will destroy lives. There is almost no limit. As we sit here today, we cannot fathom how dramatic this impact will be in 10 or 20 years. Our lives will become so digitized that losing control of your data will be tantamount to losing control of your bodily autonomy. And what's extremely concerning is that I don't hear anybody talking in the general public about these regulations. And even to the extent it gets any coverage, it seems totally disconnected from the real concerns here, which is that we figure out how to protect the right of an individual to maintain their identity, maintain control over their data. The commentary that you do see tends to be, let's make sure there's not too much red tape for businesses. There's a lot of hate for the GDPR. I understand the GDPR is far from perfect. I understand it's been a thorn in the side of most IP lawyers. But IP lawyers are not the most important stakeholders here. It does not matter if some IP lawyers are inconvenienced. So, I'm going to try to make a series of videos getting into the weeds on a lot of these specific bills, a lot of the specific provisions and the things we need to consider, and also some specific ways in which it'll impact life in every area, for everyone, rich, poor, across the political spectrum, and every industry, because this really will change everything about what it means to be an individual in society.
I'm not an expert in this whatsoever, but I think it's really crazy that I haven't heard anything about it until you told me about it. And I'm very interested to learn more. And I will keep the questions coming so we can get everybody informed.
All right, well, we'll keep at it. Yeah, I think that the thing to do is to share it